Media Day photos are important not only for the growth of the photographer taking them, but for the team themselves. Marketing is made so much easier when you have high quality photos to be used for graphics, but editing these photos can be quite difficult at times, and that's what I want to show you today. Let's get started. Before we get started, let's talk about the different types of sports media photos. You have your classic team shots on pure white backgrounds, or you can add a little spice by changing the color of the backdrop. For both of those shoots, I use the Savage brand backdrop paper, but there's another type of photos you can take as well, and they're much more creative. For this type of shoot, I got inspiration from Instagram and built my own backdrop. Now these photos required a lot more editing, but the end product was well worth the time. Regardless of which type of photo you take, you're going to spend some time editing on your computer. So let's jump onto my laptop and I'll show y'all what I do. Alright, so the first set of photos I'm going to show you how to edit are from the creative backdrop I built myself. As you can see, there's cutouts in the back of it that allow light to pass through from a flash I had set up behind it. Now in these slots I had some colored sheets that allow the light to change colors as it passed through. I also had some colored gels on the flash itself, but this helped increase the color. I used two lights for this setup. I had one main light on the player themselves, and then I had one light lighting the backdrop from behind. So the first thing I did with this was do some basic corrections in Lightroom, and then I brought it into Photoshop and did everything else. I started off by putting a basic crop on there, getting everything straight and getting the player centered up. But then I have a couple problems on the side. I clone stamp the edges to fill in the missing parts, and then I go and make a selection of the player. Next I go to the original image and copy the different smoke layers I had. That way there's a consistency through all the images. I add that back to the original composition and put the player cutout on top. I then go through and make some basic glowing effects on each layer of the backdrop. Then I go through with a smoke brush I created myself to help add texture to this lighting. This helps to make it look even more realistic. Now the only problem with this backdrop was there was a spot behind the player's head that I had to go through and fix. So what I did was I clone stamped that out, and then I had to go through and fix his hair. It's the little details like this that help make sure the images look the best they can. I then go in and add another layer of smoke on top of the player themselves to make them look like they're really a part of the scene. Now there were a few parts of the photo that you could see some weird artifacts forming, so I went through and clone stamped them out. I then save the image and put it back into Lightroom and make my final adjustments from there. One benefit of having an actual backdrop as opposed to making this all in Photoshop is that the lighting looks very realistic. You have lines around the player's face that make him look like he's truly a part of the scene. Alright, so for the next shoot, I took photos of the basketball team from my home school, and they wanted a white paper backdrop for their photos. For this image, I started off by increasing the exposure, and then I lowered the contrast. Lowering the contrast helps bring out a lot of details in the shadow areas of the player. After that, I increased the shadows a little bit to help bring out even more of that detail. And then I brought up the whites even more. This helps the background itself to look a lot more solid. After that, I played around with the texture and clarity slider to give it more of a pop. And then I took it into Photoshop. Alright, so now that we're in Photoshop, the first thing I do is hit select subject and let Photoshop work its magic. Now of course it's not going to be perfect every time, and right here you can see it missed part of the ball. So now I can go in by hand and fix that mask and then make a duplicate of the player by hitting Command J on my keyboard. So after that I go back to the original layer and make a duplicate of it. This makes sure that we have a unedited version in case we make a mistake. I turn this one off for now. So after that I go back into the original background layer and make a selection of the edge of the frame. I then go search for the Content Aware Fill tool to fill in those edges. As you can see, it does a pretty good job. I'll then go to the other side of the image and do the same thing. After looking at the image, I noticed down at the bottom corner that there's a little bit of tape there from where I held the backdrop down. I'll go in with the clone stamp tool and take this out. After looking at the image a little bit, I noticed that the top of the frame looks a little bit dingy. So what I'm going to do is make a new layer above my Content Aware Fill layer. After that, I'm going to get a very soft brush, and I'm going to brush over white on top of that. I'm then going to drop my opacity some and do the exact same thing over here on the edge of the frame. The reason I drop my opacity some is because I don't want this shadow gone completely. If you remove it all the way, it makes it look like you just cut the player out and put him on a white backdrop. This allows it to still look like you did it in camera. So after that, I'll bring the image back into the Lightroom and make any final adjustments if it needs it. I might increase the exposure a little bit and maybe bring up the shadows just a little bit. The last thing I usually do is add a little bit of saturation, but not too much or the player's going to look fake. And that's all I do for this image. Alright, so the last type of image I'm going to show you how to edit is from a band that hired me recently. The band wanted a blue backdrop for their photos, and we found a Savage paper backdrop that would work great. The only problem I had was lighting this backdrop. I used my normal lighting setup, and it didn't really work for a colored backdrop. You lost all the color in the image. As you can see on the screen recording and the before and after images, I didn't really make many differences in the image itself. I increased the exposure and contrast a little bit and then tweaked the shadows and blacks a little bit. But then I took the image in Photoshop where I made the final image look like this. So let's go into Photoshop and I'll show you how I did it. Alright, so now that we're in Photoshop, the first thing I did was make a duplicate of the band member themselves. After I do that, I do any clone stamping that needs to be done around the edges of the frame and make a quick crop. So to fix the problem of not having a blue backdrop, what I did was make a blue solid layer. Now when you do this, it doesn't look the most realistic. You can tell it's been photoshopped. So my solution to this problem was to drop the opacity of the layer itself. Now I found that 45% worked best because you still have shadows down here in the bottom corner, which makes it look more realistic, but then you get the color that you want itself. And doing this actually allows you to adjust the color to whatever color you want. If you wanted a pink color, you could. If you wanted a green, you can. This option gives you plenty of flexibility in the final edit if you have to tweak it to fit a specific brand color. As you can see, it's not too difficult to edit Media Day photos. The hardest part is getting the lighting right in camera. For most of these images, I used a 2-light setup with one light on either side of the player at about a 45-degree angle. One important note to keep in mind is just because these are athletes doesn't mean that they're good at posing themselves. As the photographer, it's your job to have poses in mind to help these athletes look the part. I hope this tutorial was helpful for you, and if you have any more questions, be sure to put them in the comment box below and I'll answer as many as I can. Also, make sure you subscribe and ring that notification bell, that way you can see the latest content I put out.